Welcome back to That's Ancient History. I'm your host, Dr. Jean Meagan, and today I am joined by fellow classicist and author Meagan Cleveland, whose debut novel, a myth retelling of the Oedipus cycle from the perspective of Princess Ismene, came out on the 30th of January 2024. And Meagan here has a BA and MA in classics, and she has taken that love of the subject to this incredible novel that we're going to talk a little bit more about today.
Thank you for that introduction. It's so nice to hear classicist, fellow classicist Megan.
Yeah. I do have a bit of a basic question that I always just think is nice to get to know somebody on the podcast. And that is, I'd love to hear about how you got into classics, like how you discovered ancient myth or ancient history and kind of what drew you to it at what point in your life. Because obviously you decided to then go on and study it for quite a few years, so something really hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think like a lot of people our age, my introduction to myth was Disney's Hercules. And my older sister's friend was like, none of these myths are right in this movie. Like Hera wasn't his mother. So it's like, oh, so you get your classic DK myth book and you read about it and then you form your own opinions. So I've always loved Greek mythology, but it took me a while to get to classics. It's kind of funny. I originally applied to University for Journalism, decided I hated it because I'm too shy. And I changed my major to art history. And a lot of the art history courses that I was taking were also like archaeological and like ancient history. So I really loved those classes and the professor. And I took an introduction to classics, and I loved that class as well. So when I was signing up for my classes for the second year, I was like, why don't I just learn ancient Greek? That could be fun. And the professor who was teaching my Greek class, well, it started off really bad because we had a professor from Germany, and the day we started, she wanted us to read, and I was like, I haven't even learned the alphabet yet. I can't read it. So then after the next week, she was gone, and someone else took over the class, and he is so amazing. His name's Professor John Walsh, and I took about 3 classes with him. And then when I got to the end of that second year at university, I was having trouble getting into my art history classes for my major because I have a disability and I was on a reduced course load. And I was crying in the hallway. And my professor walked by and he goes, why are you crying? So he got me a cup of tea, took me to his office and asked me what was wrong. And I told him. And he said, well, it might be just be me, but the answer is obvious. And I said, what? And he said, you're in the wrong major. You should be in classics. So he goes into his drawer, pulls out a form. He goes, sign this. And then he pops his head over to the next office. And the head of the department, Professor O'Cleary, was there. He says, do you think Meagan should be in classics? And he's like, yes. So they signed me in right there and changed my major. And then my life. So it was wonderful.
I love that. That's such a nice story of not just like finding a subject, but a sort of community and other people kind of lifting each other up. That's so wonderful.
Yeah, I really struggled with my first year because you go from being in such a small town to such a big place and you're just a number, you're not your person. But in Greek class, I was Megan, and it was like, oh, Megan, you've managed the subjunctive today. And it was just so exciting. And like you make a lot of friends in those courses. So classics was a really good place for me in my undergrad.
Yeah, I can imagine because even my classics courses as well, so much smaller than anyone I knew who was doing history or doing a tech subject or something. They were sitting in these massive lecture halls full of people, and then classics is so niche, you get a much smaller, but like close knit community I find at university level, which is
There
nice.
was 2 people in my Latin class in my last year.
Perfect.
And I was one of them, so it was just one other person.
It's also a nice demonstration though of how classics has a lot of overlap with other subjects. Like you said, you first sort of met antiquity through art history,
Yeah.
which kind of shows that you can enter into classics via an interest in linguistics, or you can enter into classics via an interest in art. There's lots of different routes. I had a friend who didn't do classics, but I met her because she was in my classical art course because she was an art
Mm.
history student as well.
A lot of my friends were doing double majors in like the sciences and classics. So my best friend at the time, she was doing one in something to do with chemistry and then classics. I'm like, how do you do both? It doesn't make sense.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, people blow my mind. I have a friend that did a whole classics degree with me in my undergraduate and is now a doctor, like, and not a
Like a
academic doctor,
medical
like a
doctor. Yeah.
medical doctor. We are all unique human beings made up of many different aspects.
I
Do
think
you
one of the reasons is classics is just so fun. So you need to have those fun courses as well to get through the year.
Yes. Yes, classics is fun. That should be the main message from this episode. Classics.
Mhm. The subject of the book aside, classics is fun.
Yeah, there's some hopeful moments.
Yeah.
Do you actually remember the first time you encountered the myth of, I want to call it the myth of Oedipus because that's sort of, I guess, how so many people come across these characters through plays like Oedipus Rex, but this is the story of Ismene. So do you remember the first time that you met Ismene?
Right. Well, I think a lot of the so when I first met the Oedipus myth was when I was in high school. For the grade 12 curriculum in Canada, you have to read Oedipus Rex. Nobody likes it at the time, and you're like, incest. This is a weird story, but. And then I did classics in university, and in every course where you read something in translation, it's either Oedipus Tyrannus or Antigone. So I became very closely familiar with this family. And to be honest, um, Ismene, she kind of like falls to the background, right? When I got the idea to write this book, I was going to write it from Antigone's point of view because she was the most popular character, right? And then I thought, no, I never really liked Antigone, and she's had her turn. Ismene, like, nobody knows what she's feeling. Like, her brothers have a story, her sisters, her parents, but she doesn't. So I thought, now's her time.
Yeah, that is actually really funny because I was going to ask you, not because I think it should be about Antigone, but why Ismene and not Antigone because she's the person that I think more people know the name of. But like you say, Antigone has a book.
She has her own story. I feel like I know her, and if I like met her on the street, I wouldn't really want to hang out with her. I think she'd be too intense for
Yeah.
me. But even though I don't exactly like her very much, whenever I write, she like all the things that come out of her mouth, I didn't plan those. They just kind of like came out. And it's like, oh, there she goes again, like being bossy and taking control.
That is actually an interesting point, just generally, and I imagine anyone writing a retelling has to navigate this in their own unique way, in their own approach, and in the idea that you are dealing with characters that sort of pre-exist,
Mm,
and you're writing your version of them that you're bringing to like them to life in your own way. And I wonder what the balance is like there with taking what is ancient and also kind of imagining them a little bit more fully as a modern writer.
right. The book as it is now is like I don't know, the third or fourth version of it. I completely rewrote it during the pandemic. In the first version, I tried to like have a more in my mind true depiction of Bronze Age Greece because I was kind of pandering to all my professors. I was imagining reading this and I was like, it needs to be perfect. But it made for a boring story. So I I had to change everything. And I thought, okay, this is YA. What do I love about YA? And it's the journey of self-discovery and like relationships between the characters. And I have three sisters. So I was like, all right, in some books the sisters are best friends and it's kind of nauseating. It's like, no, sisters aren't always like that. So they kind of they want the same things but they don't always come about it the same way. So my younger sister Allison was one of my beta readers, and she said one of my favorite things or her favorite things was the relationship between the sisters because she's like, yeah, that's we're not always friends all the time. And I was like, yeah, exactly.
I think that's such a great reminder, though, that these may be characters of myth, they may be ancient figures, but they're still people, they're still siblings, they still have experiences that we can relate to as modern readers.
There's a moment in the book I was rereading. parts of it last night because I haven't looked at it for a while. And it's when Ismene she goes to Antigone and she tells her about the gods come to her and has given her this mission. And Antigone's reaction is, "Oh my God, don't make up stories about the gods telling you to get what you want." And I'm like, that's something my older sister would say to me. So,
Yeah. I mean, I do imagine a scenario in which someone I know comes to me and says Apollo is speaking to them, and I'm like, do I believe them immediately?
no. And I was like, I don't think, and then later in the book as well, Antigone says something along the lines of, I always thought it would be me, not you. So I was like, because, she has her own story. So I was like, but in this one, it's his meeting story. So get
Hmm.
out of here, Antigone.
The- they do come across both like as very well-rounded though, but I do love that it's like you say, it's Ismin's story, and I love that you follow her on this journey, which is like you said, very much like in a way like a coming of age story, like getting to know yourself and your place in this world. And
Mhm.
one of the themes that obviously is really prominent throughout the book is the theme of like fate versus free will. And I wonder
Mhm.
how you felt sort of writing about that, because obviously the ancients have a very specific idea of what fate is, but maybe you wanted to do something different. I don't know.
Yeah, that was a struggle. In the first version of the book, I tried to stay true to, the canon, and everybody dies. And when I sent it to an agent, I got to have a workshop with this agent at the Festival for Literary Diversity in Brampton. And the agent said, "This is a bit of a drag. Like, I understand what you're trying to do, but like, you want to root for somebody." And I was like, okay. In the ancient, like, stories, especially in the Thebaid, which is parts of this book are heavily based on the Thebaid, which is a Latin epic written under the reign of Domitian. And in that, everyone knows their fate, but they ignore it. They think that they can still win, even though all the signs point to destruction. So in a way, Ismene is kind of doing the same thing. She's like, I'm going to ignore all the signs. Everyone's telling me I can't do it, but I still have to try because I can't just sit back and let this happen, which is kind of my modern take as well, I think.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it actually. For anybody, I guess, who's listening right now, I feel like a parallel, if there's a book you've already read that I think if you enjoyed, you'll really enjoy Riddles of the Sphinx, is Jessie Burton's Medusa. I don't know if you've read it, but
Yes, I have.
she
That's
put some
that's a
twists
very
on it.
nice comp. Thank you.
No, absolutely. If anybody has read Jessie Burton's Medusa, you will love this book, because I really feel like it's got the same charm of like a young woman's journey, that honors the original myth but does something a little bit different at the same time, and it has this hopeful side to it. It doesn't just leave you feeling distraught.
Thank you.
Actually, well, you've already mentioned there's some of your sources, but I would love to hear more about the research process. Like, what was it like? Did you sit down, write it, and then go back and check everything? Or did you do a lot of reading first and then try and smoosh it all together?
That's a great question. Like, you can tell that you're a writer too from that question. So, the first draft of Riddles of the Sphinx was actually, I wrote it for NaNoWriMo,
Ah,
and the year before I had failed. I only got to like 30,000 words, and I was like, this year I'm going to succeed. So when I decided to write the book, I was like, first thing I need to do is the research because I don't want to get stuck like I had the last year. So it's kind of funny because I hadn't really read any Greek myth retellings. And after grad school, I got a job at a bookstore, and one of my coworkers recommended I read Song of Achilles. And you know how some people in grad school can be like very pretentious, and they're like, retellings, just read the original myth in Greek. But I was like, you know what? I'm going to read it. And I loved it. And I was really inspired how Madeline Miller was like me and just had an undergrad and a master's in classics. So I was like, if she could do it, I can do it. But what myth do I want to choose? And because I had read Oedipus and Antigone so many times, I was like, I could write that in my sleep.
mhm.
So the first thing I did was reread Sophocles' Theban plays, and I made a timeline.
Okay.
And I wrote down like major themes and like inspirational quotes. And then I reread the Thebaid, did the same thing. And for the quotes that I liked, at this point, I had been out of university for a year, so my languages were quite rusty. So I just like read the quotes that I had written down in English in the original, just so I could get a better sense of
Mm.
what I would translate them to be, and like so I could have my own meaning, if that makes sense, and not just rely on someone else's translation. So I did that. And then I did some reading on Bronze Age Greece to refresh myself since I've been out of school for a while, because I really wanted to have that sort of Mycenaean palace structure and try to keep things. It's so funny that I had this book that was literally like this thick. It was a study on all these Mycenaean palaces. And what I got out of that book was a paragraph this long in in the novel when she looks into the lower city and she sees like the craftspeople from Crete and like the women in their workshops. That's from that book. So I was like, I gotta get this research in here somewhere. So once I had done all of that, I made an outline of what I wanted in the book. And then come November, I just followed that outline and I wrote the first draft. And I did a similar sort of thing when I did the rewrite in the
Mm.
pandemic.
I feel like that's also just a really good piece of advice there for anyone about to attempt NaNoWriMo this year. This is have it all set out in advance.
Yeah, preparing like I pantsed it last year and I did not finish. So when you have a plan, it does help, I hate to say.
I know exactly what you mean. Every time I try NaNoWriMo, I think, oh, I'll start a new thing that I've never written before, and I'm like, after about 20,000 words, I'm like, I don't know where this is going.
Yeah,
I
then
never.
you get to 20 to 25 and you're like,
Yeah,
nope, can't do it anymore.
that's the point. It's interesting, isn't it? That's sort of that is the point. It's funny talking about how you do so much research. It's not that dissimilar really to writing an essay in a sense, is that you do way more research than you ever write down on the page. There's always
Mhm.
more in your head that gets written down, or it all filters into one sentence when it took you days to read about. But it it's really nice reading Riddles of the Sphinx because it feels like a very accessible, readable book that I think anyone could jump into. They wouldn't really need to have like a strong basis in it, but it also has a very strong sense of place and it really feels like you're in a version of ancient Greece. And one of the things I noticed a lot was that you quite often used Greek in it. So
Yeah.
you would italicize words and you'd always provide an explanation of what they were, but in a very natural way. And I really enjoyed that. And I wondered if that was something you did intentionally that you set out to do from the beginning.
That's another great question. You have so many good questions. And I like how you said it was a version of ancient Greece because the first draft, it was like it's got to be historically accurate. It was so depressing, and people didn't like it. They're like, Ismene is not active enough. She's so passive. Because in my mind, I wanted her to be like a typical aristocratic woman, right? But then when that agent told me it was a drag, but she said the premise is amazing, your writing is really good. You can do this, but you just need to go about it a different way. Instead of just rewriting a Greek myth, you want to write in reaction to it. And I was like, oh, that's a perfect way to explain it. So I just thought about when I first got introduced to Greek myth through Hercules, and what I loved was just like the bright colors and just like the magic, and it was a different place. So I kind of wanted to create this ancient Greece of public perception instead of what should be, if that makes sense, to like make people find it more accessible. Because in the old version, people are like, what does this mean? You need a glossary in here. So so that's why I've got a glossary now. I actually put but some words in ancient Greek, and one of my friends very she meant it kindly, but I was like, that's almost cruel. She's like, if I saw this in a book, I would not even read it. And I was like, okay, I'll try to put it in English. So um my one of my beta readers was my good friend Chloe from the bookstore, and her mom is a retired English teacher. She read it as well, and she was like, oh, I really love all of the ways you incorporate Greek words. You should do this more, but like try to explain it in the book as well as the glossary. So we have Chloe's mom Amanda to thank for that.
Go Chloe's mum. I love it though. I think it's, I mean, that's an excellent example of how like multiple heads coming together. And the fact that like, I think it's a similar experience to like what I would have in that you get so deep into a subject, right? Sometimes you forget what's basic knowledge and what's not basic knowledge. So it's just nice to have
Exactly.
that feedback. And I think it has worked out perfectly.
Thank you.
I really
This
like it.
is really good for my ego today.
You reminded me of some Greek terms. I was like, oh my God, yeah, of course. I've not come across that in ages, but yeah, no, I remember that now. Thank you. It's interesting as well. Like everything you're saying, it's sort of along the lines of things I was thinking when I was reading the book. And when you mentioned there about sort of keeping it like ancient, but not letting Ismene get dragged down by the ancient um standards for women all the time. And something that I think, so if anyone reads Antigone the play or studies Antigone the play, sometimes Ismene gets portrayed as the like very, very dutiful daughter who doesn't argue, who doesn't go against things in the way that Antigone is the one that stands up for things. But that's not the Ismene we get in your book. So I'd love to hear more about her characterization.
Another perfect question. So I had the same thing, whereas I was like, Ismene's very timid in Antigone. Antigone outright says, "Come with me, let's bury Eteocles, let's go against Creon." And Ismene says no. And then from that moment, there's a break between them. It's I have a bit of a tangent for that. But if you look at the Robert Fagel's translation, he mentions that up until that point, when Sophocles is writing about Antigone and Ismene, he uses the dual voice. And then once Ismene says no, he stops using it. And I was like, oh, that's very powerful. So in the first version of the book, Ismene thought of herself in like two. So it was, we did this. And then once Antigone goes off on her own, it was like devastating for her because in her mind, it was just the two of them. But then I read Oedipus at Colonus, which I hadn't read before. And this was a revelation for me because his version of Ismene in that book is so different than it is in Antigone. There's so in the beginning of the play, I'm sure lots of people have seen paintings where Oedipus is walking through the streets and he's got his hand on Antigone's shoulder and she's leading him around. So while they're going on their journey together, Ismene, she leaves the palace sort of in disguise and she brings them news from the palace. And the news that she specifically brings are prophecies. So it's like, whoa, because at that point I decided Ismene should have these visions because originally in the first version it was a way for her to be included without actually being in the action because a woman wouldn't really be on the battlefields in my mind. But then I was like, oh my God, Sophocles is supporting my idea here almost. So I was like, okay, if Sophocles says it's okay, then it is okay. So it was really great to see Ismene in that way. And Oedipus actually says to her and Antigone that his family is backwards, that his sons are like women staying at home, and his daughters are the active ones who are outside and actually doing things. And I was like, this is great. This is exactly what I want this to be. And it made me feel better that it was Sophocles saying that women can be active. So I was like, all right, let's do it.
I love that. I love the way that you can think of something and then find that there was an ancient person who also thought that too. Like, yes.
It's vindicating. You're like, yes.
I have to say, of out of all the other characters of mythology that I can think of, the one that Ismene and Riddles of the Sphinx reminded me of the most, or at least I felt that there was parallels between, was Cassandra a little bit. I
Yes.
wondered if that was something that was like that you thought as well.
Well, so with the first version, it was a way for her to see the action unfold without being there. And I kind of got that idea from Percy Jackson because Percy Jackson has a lot of his dreams about Cronus and what's going on with his forces through dreams. So it's like, okay, Ismene can do that. And then when I was doing my rewrite, I decided that instead of just talking about the Oracle at Delphi, she should go there.
Mm.
And I did this deep dive into oracles. I feel like I'm an oracle expert now. And one of the things that I found out that I actually didn't know in almost 10 years of studying classics, nobody really told me this, and I was flabbergasted that there's another oracle of Apollo in Thebes, And the oracle there is called the Oracle of Apollo Ismenius.
Wow.
Ismene. So I was like, what? So I was looking into that, and I found out that there's a university in the States who has a field school there and they're excavating. So I was like, shoot your shot. So I emailed them, I was like, can I get on a FaceTime and ask you questions? And they're like, yeah, sure. So I called them and they're like, we can't actually tell you about our research until it's published, but you can ask us questions and we can tell you answers if we're able. So instead of telling me about their excavation, they told me about major like sources for the temple and the oracle. So Pausanias in his travel guide, he has a whole section about it there. He says what it looks like and everything. Pindar, the famous poet, he also talks about it because he's a proud Theban. And I think Plutarch mentions it a bit as well. So it's like, I didn't know this. So that became this important part. And it's not historically accurate. So I think those American classicists might be mad at me that I made this book sort of origin story for that temple. But I just thought people need to know about it. So I wanted to include it in this version.
I love that though. Like you say, you got to incorporate something that not a lot of people know about. Like I had no idea that there was an Ismenius Apollo temple in Thebes. Never heard of that before, ever.
Yeah, and a lot of stories misattribute oracles that were given. I think the one about Croesus that was given by the oracle in Thebes, not Delphi, I think. So, but everybody thinks it's Delphi. So it's like that's crazy. And we everybody knows that with the oracle at Delphi, there's like the fumes and Apollo speaking through the oracle, but it's at the temple of Apollo Ismenius. The way they tell the future is through pyromancy, so looking into the fire and smoke. This is another thing I didn't know about, but when I did another read through of Oedipus, like I've read it so many times, it's just too much sometimes. But there's hints where Tiresias, who is blind, looks into the fire and he looks at the embers to tell the future, which is a nod to the temple there, right? And I was like, I didn't realize that. I thought it was weird the blind man was looking in the fire, but now that makes sense.
Mhm.
So that was really exciting to have this idea of Ismene that I just made up for convenience be backed up by all these ancient sources I didn't even realize.
I mean, part of me thinks it's fate,
That's a
or
scary
there,
thought sometimes.
but also there's also just you've got to remember, and I think consider the fact that you've spent a lot of time reading and studying antiquity, and sometimes these things filter into our minds without us noticing them, or the fact that know maybe you might not know about this one specific temple, but you know about something similar, so you then start to write about something similar. But then of course it makes sense there would be another parallel antiquity. So I think it's just that ancient knowledge sort of coalescing.
Yeah, sometimes it's things you don't realize you know that you actually know.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. My favorite thing, okay, in the whole book, I mean, I love the whole book, but like one of my favorite things about the book is how prominent myth is in the book. So this is a book that is obviously a retelling of a myth. It's a retelling of his mean story, the Oedipus cycle, everything that happens there to Antigone and all of the other characters. But throughout the story, once you've read it, whoever's listening, you will know this too, but you will get myth through the lens of plays that Ismene witnesses, or myths that are told to her by her. I wanted to say nanny, not nanny, but you know what I
Yeah,
mean,
her nurse.
her
Yeah, she's
lady maid,
basically a nanny.
nanny. The myths that she sees in her visions of the past, and the myths that she recalls about her ancestors, and I really liked that although this is a retelling of one myth, it's also sort of a reminder of how intertwined Greek mythology is, and that what we think of as myths now could also be myths to characters of mythology. Um,
Mhm.
and I would just love to hear more about that.
Yeah. So in the first version of the book, um, I really like classic books like Anna Green Gables and Little Women that start with their children and you follow them throughout their lives. So the first version of the book was like that. And in that version, the way she got over the grief of her parents was her brother Eteocles telling her stories, and he would tell her all these myths, and then they would inform what she did later on. But in the new version of the book, Eteocles isn't as present as he is in the first version. So I had her nurse Pura tell her all these myths. And a lot of that also comes from you don't know how much the reader knows. So you want to have that all that introduced. And my reasoning for having her not know about some of these myths and go to discover them was based on a paper I wrote during grad school. We read the Thebaid in Latin, and then we had to write a paper about it. And my paper was about how this is gonna get complicated, but so the destruction of the family of Oedipus is like a microcosm of the destruction of the Theban state, and the way that Statius communicates that is through the verb consumo, and there's three characters that exhibit different meanings of that verb. So Adrastus, Polynices, and then Titius, and their the effects of their consumption have to do with how close they have been to familial violence. So you've got Adrastus, who's a descendant of Tantalus. So he's kind of removed from that crime, but he wastes all those Argive people in a Theban war that he didn't really need to be part of. Polynices, his father committed the crime, so he's a bit closer to that, and he's the one responsible for this war because he wanted to take back Thebes from Eteocles, even though Adrastus was going to step down and let him be king of Argos. Like, he had another kingdom. And then you have Titius, who he's the one who committed a crime himself. He killed his own brother. And in that book, he actually literally consumes another person. He eats somebody's brains. So what I wanted to explore in this book was like effects of violence and like the mythology that comes around that. So on her journey, she learns about all these other cursed families, and she's like, oh, how terrible. And then she finds out that she's one of these and she didn't know, and then that's what's sort of responsible. So she has to break that cycle of violence to try to stop the war, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I love it, and I think anyone who reads the book will get to enjoy a lot of different myths and also learn a lot of different themes in Greek mythology and show like how you're saying that this sort of like familial violence comes up again and again and how then you get these curses put upon families. Be prepared for violence if you're not.
There's a bit of violence in it.
There's some violence. I mean, but that is Greek mythology. There's a lot of violence. But there's some wonderful, beautiful moments in the book too, and I really, really enjoyed reading it, and I do highly recommend anyone who's listening who hasn't read it yet, to check it out. But that actually brings me to my final question, and I don't know if you've listened to That's Ancient History before, but I ask everyone exactly the same question to finish off the episode, which is, I would love a book recommendation from you. So, everybody listening has added, presumably, Riddles of the Sphinx to their TBR if they haven't read it yet. But it would be wonderful to get another book recommendation from you, whether that be a retelling that you love, or a non-fiction book, or an ancient work. It can be anything at all. It doesn't even have to be related to our discussion.
You know, I do listen to your podcast as well, and I made a list. But um I read some arcs for Greek myth retellings in September, and some of them like really blew me away. Um, One of them was a book about Medea by Ailish Quinn. A lot of authors write the myth retellings and they're like, this is and the publishers will say, this is the natural successor to Circe. And it's like, not quite, it's just about a woman in myth. But I feel like Ailish Quinn's Medea is the follow-up to Circe because there is so many familiar themes. She's also a witch. She also has this divine parentage, and she's struggling to be a good person in a world that's against her. So if you really loved Circe, I'd say read Ailish's Medea. I'm gonna try to say this name. I apologize if I say it wrong. Iona Papadopoulos wrote Winter Harvest, which is a really beautiful and heartbreaking depiction of Demeter's life. Yeah,
We need more Demeter books.
it's really good. And then one more, again, I apologize if I say this wrong. Kika Hatzopoulos, she wrote a YA book called Threads That Bind, and it's inspired by Greek myth, but it's set in sort of a turn of the century city like New York, but it's not New York. And she's a fate that goes on police missions, and she uses her power to like control lives to like solve a murder, and it was so good and so original and written by a Greek person, so I really recommend that one as well.
Well, I haven't read any of those, so now I have lots more books on my TBR.
I'll send you the what the covers look like so you
Yes,
can find
please.
them easier.
Yeah. And then also, for anybody listening or watching, I will link them along with Megan's phenomenal book in either the description or the show notes, whichever format this is being consumed in. There will be links. But actually, even though I said that was the last question, I've decided to sneak in one
Okay.
last question, which is whether you intend on writing more Greek myth retellings.
Okay, I do have an idea. Um, Another book that I've read a lot is Electra, and I have a love-hate relationship with Electra. But instead of writing it about her, I'd really like to write it about Orestes because I think it's just so sad that he's been raised to avenge a father he never knew and take part in a family he wasn't part of, essentially. And it's kind of an exploration of like toxic masculinity in the ancient world. So I'd really like to do that. I have a page, but I hope I can write more this year.
I mean,
So
you've had a lot going on.
yeah,
You've
I
just
am also
published a book.
got the book coming out, and then 2 months later I'm having a baby. So that's also gonna take up some
Nothing.
time.
Nothing at all. Well, when you do get around to writing Orestes, I would love to read it, even if it's a while away.
All right, well I will send you I'd send it to you if you'd like.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking more about the process of writing Ismene and just sharing your enthusiasm for classics and ancient history.